Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us in this conversation titled For the Sake of the Climate, Meditations on Retooling the Economy. This is part of a three conversation series, the last of the three. The other two also engage climate change, the first in terms of the institutional imagination, the second in terms of climate regimes emerging around forestry. And so this one is really focusing much more on the economy. I just want to very quickly thank the Mellon Foundation, which has been funding these conversations. They've provided us funds for a Sawyer seminar on precision and uncertainty in a world of data. And so this conversation is part of that series. And without any further introduction, let me just quickly introduce you to our moderator of this conversation. Cindy Isenhour is an associate professor with the joint appointment in the Department of Anthropology and the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine, and she'll just lay out our program for us. Thank you, Cindy, for taking this initiative.
Absolutely. And Navita, thank you so much for the invitation. I was really thrilled to have been invited and honored to take part in such an important conversation with a really amazing set of panelists. So thank you to Navita, to Perry for all your support, and to the panel for being here today. And of course, thanks to the audience. We look forward to hearing from you today as well. So to get started, I did just want to remind everyone what the intention was for this particular climate workshop. And that was to interrogate contradictions that inform climate thinking. Now, I'm sure you could think of many, but today we're particularly focused on economic contradictions and this central idea that there seem to be some people who believe that the kind of dominant growth-based capitalist economic system is the very root problem of the climate crisis, while others seem to believe that it is the root solution. So we want to question dominant ways of knowing the economic by asking questions such as, how do the economic approaches that currently dominate climate policy come under pressure and or put themselves into crisis? And we'd also like to be able to reflect with all of you on revisionist movements. So asking questions like, how might degrowth, sufficiency, donut economies, new deals, or other alternative, maybe even speculative ways of approaching the economy provide paths for livability in the Anthropocene? As we do that, I'd like to invite everyone to try to broaden our imaginations on what economy is. I think a lot of the conversation will likely be framed around dominant contemporary structures, but I'd like to invite us all to remember that an economy is a basic structure or condition of economic life, of achieving well-being and sustenance. They are societally produced structures that allow for the allocation, trade, and consumption of resources. And over time and cross-culturally and across different geographies, we've seen and continue to see significant heterogeneity in economic form. So I invite everyone to think about those possibilities and those realities, even while we recognize that there may be a hegemonic form that is dominant today. I also wanted to acknowledge that our audience is likely diverse and invite that diversity. And some folks have likely been thinking about the relationship between the economy and the climate for a really long time. We have ecological economists on the panel today who have made this their career, but others may be just coming to really start to think about the relationship between the economy and the climate or other forms of environmental degradation. So let me just start with perhaps my own assertion that there is really good empirical support for the need to interrogate the economic status quo. And we could write entire books about this. In fact, some of our panelists have. But let me just start with two very basic ideas here. One is that we have empirical evidence that global economic growth has tracked very closely with total environmental impact through time. Now, it is certainly true that economic processes have become more efficient, so that, for every economic unit, we're emitting less carbon or using fewer materials. But these efficiency gains continue to be cannibalized by growth in emissions so that we're still getting growth in net impacts. We have no examples of absolute decoupling of economic growth from environmental impact. That's just one reason. We also have the recognition that the costs and benefits of contemporary economic activity are highly unevenly distributed across the globe and within societies, in fact, such that many societies or groups of people who are least responsible or culpable for the climate crisis are those who are most likely to be negatively affected. I do recognize that I've not provided any citations here, but at the risk of self-promotion, I'll just put a few short commentaries or policy briefs that I've recently been involved in that have lots of citations to back these up. Those are in the chat in case folks are interested. Okay, so now, with no further ado, I am thrilled to introduce our esteemed panelists to you all briefly. And we do have longer versions of their bibliography or their bios on the Sawyer seminar website. So I invite you to check them out there, as well as links to the additional work. So Paul Ferraro is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University. He collaborates with scientists, lawyers, engineers, and program administrators to develop evidence-based environmental programs and to understand causal relationships, both natural and anthropogenic, in complex environments. He's particularly interested in elucidating the environmental and behavioral mechanisms through which environmental problems arise and through which environmental solutions are successful. As part of these efforts, he directs or co-directs two scholar practitioner collaboration centers, the Environmental Program Innovations Collaborative and the Center for Behavioral and Experimental Agri-Environmental Research. Thanks for being here, Paul. Jason Hickel is an economic anthropologist, author, and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He is professor at the Institute of Environmental Sciences and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and is a visiting senior fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. He serves as an associate editor of the journal World Development, is on the statistical advisory panel of the UN Human Development Report, the advisory board of the Green New Deal for Europe, and the Harvard Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice. His work focuses on global inequality, post-development, and ecological economics, which are the subjects of his two most recent books. First, The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions, published in 2017, and Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, published in 2020. Jason, thank you so much for being here. Next is Mizan Khan, who is currently the Deputy Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development and Program Director of Least Developed Countries University Consortium of Climate Change. He's a lead author for the IPCC, has served as the lead negotiator on climate finance for the Bangladeshi delegation since 2001, and was the vice chair of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group under the UNFCCC from 2002 to 2004. In addition to his work for the government and the development sector in Bangladesh and beyond, he has extensive experience in academia with appointments through time at the North-South University, the University of Manitoba, University of Maryland, and Brown University. Khan has authored a wide range of journal publications and several books on climate change politics, including The Paris Framework for Climate Change Capacity Building, published in 2018, and Toward a Binding Climate Change Adaptation Regime, published in 2014. Mizan, so nice to see you, and thank you for being here today. Next is Michael Northcott, who is a professor emeritus of ethics at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, a professor of religion and ecology at the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies, and a guest professor of systemic theology at the Evangelical Faculty of Theology in Leuven, Belgium. He's been an active participant in efforts to develop environmental awareness and policy in churches in England and Scotland. His wide-ranging research in environmental theology and ethics has examined the relationship between ethics, ecology, and religion broadly, with a particular focus on work, economic value, and climate change. Among his many books are God and Gaia, Religious Ethics on a Living Earth, which is forthcoming, that will be great, and A Political Theology of Climate Change, which was published in 2013. Michael, thank you so much for being here. And last but certainly not least, Patricia Elaine Perkins is a professor of environmental and urban change at York University. She's an ecological economist concerned with climate justice and addressing global inequalities. She is interested in the political ecology of commons governance, local economies and energy transitions, feminist theory, and practice in times of climate change. Perkins has directed international research projects on community-based watershed organizing in Brazil and Canada, and on climate justice and equity in watershed management with partners in Mozambique, South Africa, and Kenya. She's the editor of Local Activism for Global Climate Justice, published in 2020, and Water and Climate Change in Africa, published in 2013. She was also the lead author for the 6th assessment report of the IPCC chapter on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation. Patricia, thank you so much for being here today. Okay, so as you can all see, we have a wonderful panel today, and how we're going to structure our discussion is in 3 parts essentially. So I've asked the panelists to answer 3 questions, and we'll have rotating order of answers. And I'd like to just go ahead and get started with the first one, which links back to the title of the panel. So I'll ask you all, what needs to be done with the current economic system for the sake of the climate, as the title made clear? And the title said retooling, and I'm wondering if you think that's the right word, and why or why not. So I'm going to stop my share here, and we will turn it over first to Michael. I think Michael is here, right?
Yes.
Michael, thanks for being here. So what do you think? Is retooling the right word? I'm guessing that Michael may be having some problems with audio. Why don't we come back to him, and I'll go first to Patricia then. Patricia, what do you think? Is retooling the right word?
Thank you, Cindy, for that wonderful introduction and for the for organizing this. It's quite an amazing opportunity, I think, to have this, to be involved in this kind of a discussion. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see that at all? Let's see, slideshow.
Yep, no problem.
Start. Yes, go. Good. Okay. Let me move to my first slide. I would like to start by acknowledging that I live and work in a beautiful territory that has been taken care of by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. In Tikaranto, where I live, these are the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Attawandaronk, or neutral peoples. Perhaps you're aware that around the Great Lakes of North America, there's a covenant among these peoples that's at least 880 years old, called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And it reminds everyone to care for and peacefully share. Let's see. Can I move to the next one? Let's see. To peacefully share the land, the waters, and the bounty. And as the map that I showed earlier indicates, territories overlap. Boundaries are fluid. People need to work and live respectfully together. The world is already in the middle of a climate emergency. It's not coming, it's here. And I think it's caused by the economy. I appreciate what you said, Cindy, about how we can see the economy as the networks of relationships that allow people to trade and provide for their needs. But I think that what I'm using, the economy that I see is something that is separate from the relationships with the world. And when we use this word economy as a separate thing, we're already distancing the people from the relationships with the more than human world and also with each other. So I see that the economy itself, this economy that we live in now, created by my ancestors, those Europeans who traveled all over the world seizing land and resources, killing and enslaving people, reaping enormous profits from these actions over hundreds of years, and rationalizing this violence using religious justifications. That economy is the problem. And it's unethical, in fact, genocidal in many cases, as we've seen over the past few years in Canada. The reverberations and the implications of that, those economic processes of colonialism and imperialism are still with us. And they are what's resulting in climate change, as climate change is a symptom of that problematic economy. But there are other ways to live on the earth. It's not all, there is hope. Humans don't have to do this. The economy is a dreadful 500-year aberration. It's a brutal moment, let's hope, in the roughly 130,000 years of human history. People know deep down that collaboration helps everyone, and that human well-being depends on social and material relationships, with exchanges made willingly in contexts of mutual trust, respect, and empathy. I think I'm going to stop sharing now because those were the only main slides that I wanted to show. Let's see how I do this. I'm sorry, the tech is not great. How do I get to stop sharing? I don't see the button. Thank you for taking care of that. Okay, so I was saying that exchanges can be made willingly. Exchanges can be mutually beneficial, and that depends on respect and empathy among peoples. And I don't think this is a naive or impossible vision, because it has existed in the world. Humans have built civilizations that lived and cared for other beings within bountiful ecosystems for thousands of years, without trashing those ecosystems. These civilizations created and evolved wise ways of controlling greed and overweening power and domination of others, and territorial expansion and theft. Humans who are alive now can learn about how they did that by respectfully listening to indigenous peoples who still hold the remnants of those cultures. We can build fair, collaborative, not competitive, inclusive, relationship-based systems in which humans and other beings can flourish. We can still step outside and beyond the economy, which brings more grief than it does well-being. While the economy's threat to human and much of other life on Earth is grave, it's serious, it's pressing. Outcomes are not at all certain, but I believe it's apparent that the changing climate is a wake-up sign and that many people are heeding it. I think that's all I want to say at this point right now, but I'm really grateful that we're having this discussion, and I do want to hear more from other people.
Thank you, Patricia. Do you have just out of curiosity and to push a little bit on the question, do you have a word that you think describes what you would say? Is it retooling the economy? Or is it revisiting something in the past?
Yeah, what I would say that the economy doesn't need to be retooled. It needs to be localized, socialized, and made collaborative, not competitive.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Patricia. I'm going to go back now to Michael and see if we can get his audio. Michael, are you able to join us now?
How is that? Can you hear me?
We can, yes. Welcome. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm just I was out and I'm just returning, but if it works, then I will continue using my my mobile phone, which actually has got quite a good signal, so it may be the best solution.
Sure, you sound great.
Evening.
Crystal clear.
Good. I'm very glad to be following on the previous speaker who spoke very much from my to my own beliefs as well. if we look at the history of unsustainability, while scientists often point to extinctions said to have arisen from the behaviors of indigenous peoples in the past, I mean, for example, mammoths in North America and in Siberia, there's at least a reasonable degree of evidence that in fact these extinctions were a result of geophysical changes and not only human activity. So I think that the previous speaker is quite right that the real issue with the economy is the industrial, well, I'm going to put it more explicitly, perhaps than she did, is the contrast between indigenous ways of life and procurement and industrial ways of life and procurement. And that's the real issue that we're facing, it seems to me. And the industrial way of life is really only 300 years old. So in terms of human history, it's a remarkably short span of time. And yet in that span of time, an amazing amount of damage has been done to the ecosystems of the earth. I mean, that's completely unquestionable. So the issue then becomes, well, how do we revise industrial civilization? So I put it perhaps in a slightly larger frame than purely economics. I mean, the danger of purely talking about economics is the danger of just landing up in the world of models, because most economists are not natural scientists, or they like to think they are, but they simply make models. And they model human behavior, and they say, well, this model will have this outcome and this model will have that outcome. And the basic model of most economists is the famous supply and demand curve, which I studied at school. And it's an extremely simplistic account of how humans interact and behave with each other and with the environment. Though, yeah, I agree with the previous speaker that competition is clearly at the heart of that, the supply and demand curve. So it's not that I don't think we need economic reform, but I think more importantly, we need reform of industrial processes and procedures. For me, one of the biggest issues in relation to climate change is the emptying of creatures from ecosystems. So historical surveys of fishes globally, led by Dan Pauly, a Canadian at British Columbia, UBC, have revealed that if you look back at fishermen's logs, and not only at satellite data, which only really extends back to the 1950s, 90% of the fish in the ocean have disappeared since 1945 compared to the pre-war period, 90%. It's a similar story on land. We've emptied the ecosystems of the world of most land animals, and increasingly the insects are disappearing too. There was a study of a German national park, forest, where they found a 75% decline that had occurred in insects, and that was inside a protected area. Because of course, if you spray these new neonicotinoid systemic pesticides in one area, they spread around. They don't just stay in the area where you spray them. They're carried by insects and seeds in the wind and so on everywhere. So we are emptying the world of life. And this is actually a major issue when it comes to climate change. Many of the climate changes that we're currently experiencing are in fact local in origin and not global. I wouldn't personally argue that we're facing a global carbon climate crisis yet. We're facing many, many local climate change crises. And these primarily emanate from industrial land use practices, overharvesting, and these practices turn off the capacity of other creatures to create and sustain habitats which are habitable for them and for us. I mean, you kindly said in your introduction that I'm writing a book on God and Gaia, and at the heart of the Gaia theory is the idea that the creatures of the earth have, over millions of years, cooperated in such ways as to create an atmosphere and an ocean and land areas with soil, which have made it possible for humans to evolve to their present state. And essentially what the industrial economy does is to unravel that by diminishing the numbers of species other than humans that exist. So to revive the capacity of the Earth to respond to climate change, which is both a human and a natural phenomenon. There are geophysical issues in climate change and there are human issues in climate change. But in order for the Earth to be able to adapt to the climate change that's already happening, we need to revive ecosystems. And we do that by reviving the numbers of other creatures in them.
Great. Okay.
The question then arises in economic terms, how would you use an economy to do that? Well, I would say that the first priority for me would be reforming industrial fishing.
Okay.
We need regulation of industrial fishing. And then the second priority for me would be a change in land use patterns. At the moment, we have this very strong dominance in food systems of monocultures, which essentially excludes other animals. And so for me, these are these two very practical things, but and I haven't in my head got an answer to what economic tools we would need to achieve this end. But for me, the key is to revive the capacity of the Earth to respond to the changes that we are in part responsible for. And we do that by reviving the number of our fellow creatures.
Thank you so much, Michael. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but we will be back to you, of course, in future rounds. Thank you very much for your input here. Okay, I'd like to move to Jason Hickel now. Jason, is retooling the right word?
Thanks very much, and thanks to the previous panelists. So for me, retooling feels a bit weak, actually. It suggests a kind of reformism, but I think we're at a stage where we know that reformism is inadequate. So the climate emergency is ultimately, I think we should understand, an effect of capitalism. And the specific dimension of capitalism that's at stake here, of course, is the dependency of capitalism on perpetually increasing commodity production as measured in terms of market prices, which of course economists euphemistically refer to as growth. And we should point out that under capitalism, the purpose of increasing commodity production is not primarily to meet human needs, such as for housing and healthcare and so on. Rather, the purpose is to extract and accumulate corporate profit, right? This is the overriding objective. This gets framed in terms of growth in order to make it appear natural and inevitable and acceptable. It's a very powerful framing. So growth becomes, in effect, the alibi, as it were, of capital accumulation. It's sort of capital's PR story, right? It's how we're encouraged to buy into processes of exploitation that we might otherwise reject. So in this sense, I see growth as ideological in the Gramscian sense, right? Now, from the perspective of climate mitigation, which is the main focus here, growth is a problem because we know that GDP is very closely coupled to energy use, okay? So more growth means more energy use. And as you can imagine, more energy use makes it more difficult to decarbonize rapidly enough to stay under the within the carbon budgets for 1.5 or 2 degrees. This is very crucial to understand, actually. This is the core of climate economics, in fact, that's the more energy use you have, the more difficult decarbonization is to achieve. And indeed, this fact is widely understood also by policymakers. So to square the assumption of continued growth in high-income nations with the Paris climate objectives, policymakers increasingly are forced to rely on speculative technological solutions like carbon capture, right, or efficiency improvements that are supposedly sufficient to drive a dramatic decoupling of GDP from energy use. But the empirical record is at odds with this assumption. Scientists have for years rejected this approach as highly risky and not supported by empirical evidence. So if we dial back our assumptions about technological solutions to more empirically supported levels, in other words, yes to technology, but yes also to science, then it becomes clear that the only way for us to achieve the Paris climate targets is for high-income nations to actively scale down socially less necessary forms of production, right? So in other words, forms of production that are organized primarily around capital accumulation and elite consumption, rather than around human well-being. And here I have, I mean, you can think of what this might be: SUVs, private jets, industrial beef, advertising, military production, the practice of planned obsolescence, and so on. So instead, to organize production around human well-being, right? Housing, healthcare, education, public transit, renewable energy, and so on. So this is known in the scientific literature as degrowth, which has now been discussed in several major international reports, including by the UN IPBES, the IPCC in 2 of their reports recently, and the European Environment Agency. Of course, the question that immediately arises is, won't degrowth lead to unemployment and a loss of livelihoods? So I want to address this very briefly. If our society requires less labor in order to produce the things that we actually do need, then we can address this by simply shortening the working week and sharing necessary work more evenly, thereby precluding any possibility of a rise in unemployment. You can also introduce a public climate job guarantee, thus, again, permanently ending unemployment and ensuring a just transition for workers to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation: renewable energy capacity outlay, ecological regeneration, and so on. And we can focus on rolling out universal public services, housing, healthcare, public transportation, and so on. I want to emphasize that degrowth along these lines is extremely powerful when it comes to climate mitigation, because it reduces energy demands and makes it possible, therefore, to decarbonize the economy much more quickly, fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees. So when we hear this ideology that 1.5 degrees is now impossible, this is true only if we accept continued growth in high-income nations. If we take that assumption off the table, 1.5 degrees is very achievable, and this is incredibly hopeful news. By the way, this approach is also powerful in reducing resource use, and therefore reversing biodiversity loss, which the last panelist addressed. So in conclusion, I want to very briefly remark on the fact that we're in a completely bizarre political situation, particularly in the United States, where people on the right argue that climate mitigation is bad because it might interfere with growth. People on the so-called left then respond by saying, no, climate mitigation will be good for growth, right? So instead of questioning the conflation of growth with social progress and human well-being, they accept these terms and try to sell climate mitigation as compatible with and indeed in service of the interests of further capital accumulation. This is a completely unnecessary capitulation to capitalist logic. And it makes me wonder, what kind of left do we have? The discourse is woefully inadequate, and the proper response is to point out that growth is an ideological term that sanitizes processes of extraction and capital accumulation, and that high-income nations do not need more aggregate commodity production, and indeed can deliver improvements in social outcomes with less commodity production and less resource and energy use, as the degrowth literature has demonstrated now empirically. So I'll leave it at that and pick up on this in the next round.
Thank you so much, Jason. Okay, and I think next we're going to go to Paul. Paul, please take the floor.
All right, thank you.
Word?
Fascinating panel, lots of different opinions. So I'm going to provide at least one dissenting opinion. So I think retool is the right word. I looked in the dictionary just to see what it actually means, and it means revise, modify, reorganize. So it is not a dramatic transformation of our norms or ideologies or the way in which we actually operate. There's 2 guiding principles why I think it's the right word. So the first is just from my own experience. If you want to have successful policies without extreme coercion or concentration of power, you need to work with human nature rather than against it. That's an important starting point to start where people are and their aspirations and their goals. But more importantly, we need cheap, clean energy at scale, and we need it now if we're going to avert climate change catastrophe. We have to lower carbon emissions by a factor of 2 within the next 10 or 20 years. What system other than capitalist market system can pull that off? So for all the negative things that it has generated over the years, it also has generated incredible innovations, lowered world poverty, improved longevity and health in ways that haven't been done in the past. Right? So even if you had another system in mind for reorganizing the economy. I find it highly implausible that capitalism, market economics would be abandoned by the world on the time frame that we need to act. And so that means we have to act on the climate crisis within the framework of the current system. I know that's going to sound like it's defeatism, but this urgency to me seems like a need for innovation seems like that's actually what capitalism, market economics does well. It innovates, it moves entire groups of people quickly and systematically, and that's what we need for the solution. So that acknowledgement forced me to believe we can get rid of the bad things while preserving the good, the decouple word, right? And this idea that there's no good empirical evidence for it, there is some empirical evidence for it, but part of the reason is we haven't actually tried. We do very ineffective interventions to try to reduce carbon emissions. It's only been really the last 20 years that we've tried to do some more effective R&D, investing in actual innovations, and working on carbon pricing. A lot of people say carbon pricing doesn't work, but we have barely tried it. If you look at Sweden, the only place where it's really been tried successfully for a very small part of the economy, it actually works very well in terms of reducing emissions. And just, with the rest of the half of my time, I thought I'd react to the other speakers. So this idea of, of looking to the past for guidelines, I think it's super important to look at history and find good ideas and look for ideas for how we can reorganize our norms and our belief systems. But also when I look back at indigenous cultures, I see also oligarchical forms of politics. I see concentration of power, use of coercion to force conformity, and quite hard sanctions when people do not conform to these uniform standards. And so that worries me a little bit. You can't take just the good ideas without some of the bad, just like with the capitalist system. And then the degrowth, I still have problems with the degrowth in the sense that 63% roughly of emissions are coming from low and particularly middle income or newly middle income countries. And I don't understand, those countries are still aspiring for the levels of growth that we've achieved because they have led to dramatic reductions in poverty, longer longevity, reductions in child mortality. I just want to put up a quick graph just because I know the GDP gets beat up a lot, and I beat it up a lot as well. But here's just a graph of child mortality versus GDP per capita, right? For all its weaknesses and all its imperfections, there definitely is a clear relationship between the two, right? And you can bring up lots of graphs like that. I'll just bring up another one. This is decline in child mortality by changes within countries. So in case you're worried that there's some kind of other spurious confounder in that previous graph, you're seeing the same sort of pattern. I don't see these other countries wanting to forego their ability to move down those various poverty, child mortality graphs and do better. And so for all those reasons, I think retool is the right word. And I'm trying to remain optimistic that it will work. And thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Paul. Okay, so the last word in this first question goes to Mizan Khan. Mizan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. Yes, already we have got to hear many brilliant and new ideas, starting with Patricia, who is an ecological economist. My background also is ecological economist as a student, and I was a MacArthur Fellow in ecological economics at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland. So thank you, Patricia. Yes, in fact, retooling, I mean, is not just radical changes. I agree with Paul that retooling means changes can be within the prevailing structure. We need to kind of reintroduce the tools that we have got to learn in our economics classes, for example. And for this, let me get back a little to about the origin of classical economics. You all know that classical economics did originate out of moral philosophy. And then Adam Smith, the father of classical economics, wrote a book called Theory of Moral Sentiments 17 years back in 1759, before his classic of Wealth of Nations in 1776. And in that Theory of Moral Sentiments, he argued strongly that in order for invisible hands to work, each economic agent must behave morally and ethically. And that is what he meant by a market system where invisible hand will serve as kind of a cybernetic auto-correction tool. But that was not happening kind of under neoclassical economics. Classical economics had some direct relationship with nature, where price was fixed, for example, based on inputs. But neoclassical economics came in and got a little divorced from nature and natural resources, and prices of goods and services were being dictated or defined based on subjective preferences. And that is where we got kind of, got deconstructed with our original mission of economics. And that is reflected, this aberrant deviant behavior is reflected in the climate diplomacy. As I am a negotiator, so I will refer to the origins of the convention, for example, the basic principle of common but differentiated responsibility based on respective capability. And it has been also in the Paris Agreement, but that is not complied with. Common problem is a global problem, but the responsibility is differential because some countries have developed historically, and some of you have referred to that now we have the high-income countries, and also major emitters now cut across both the global north and the global south. But they are not behaving the way as Adam Smith had foreseen, not morally, not ethically. That is where we have this problem. For example, as a citizen from a low-income country, climate change is a question of our physical survival. Climate change is life-threatening for us. But for high-income countries, both from the global north and global south, it's kind of a lifestyle threatening. Climate change threatens their heavily consumptive lifestyle. I spent 18 years of my life in the Western world and 8 years in America, the mecca of capitalism. There I felt not very good when I saw so much food is wasted, you know. So we need to retool this economy with a stronger dose of behavioral economics. Patricia at the beginning has mentioned about the competitive versus cooperative model. In fact, we, in the 21st century, we cannot afford to live in an weird world, what I call, in an interconnected world, in a world of Hobbesian world. We must live in the world of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Kropotkin's world, where cooperative behavior, in fact, under neoclassical economic model of game theory, the final conclusion was that ultimately cooperative genes dominate rather than competitive genes. So we need to retool our economic thinking about ways of how to reintroduce those cooperative genes. Yeah, you know, for the last few decades, in fact, for the last 20 years, the critics of neoclassical economics are being awarded the Nobel Prizes, starting from Tinbergen down to Amartya Sen and Eleanor Ostrom. Amartya Sen has written a piece back in 1977 with the title of Rational Fools. He critiqued strongly that we human beings are not the just part of self-interest. We human beings have altruistic genes. And it is the society, it is the environment that depends how we are brought up. The contradiction of our economics is in America, I have spent 7-8 years for my graduate education. And in the class, we have been taught about, for example, internalization of externalities under the very neoclassical economics. But in the Western world, for example, that is done. In the solid waste dumping, extremely costly, even through environmental tax, even in America, for example, through different ways, this pollution is taxed. But in terms of climate change, because these emissions straddle across borders, they don't stay put. That is the reason states and citizens don't behave morally. So we are having a huge disconnect between climate science as represented by the latest AR6 and the climate policy, both nationally and internationally. We need to think of how we can bridge this gap between science and policy. And here are different tools, for example. We need to internalize the externality. This is one thing. Another thing is economics is the reflection of politics. So still we are living in a political world of Westphalian world, about 400 years back when a state system in Europe has been formed. So we need to have enlightened self-interest where the focus should be on restoring the global commons problem, taking care of the global commons problem and more and better provision of global public goods. As I mentioned, we live in an weird world, interconnected world. So isolated life cannot, we can pursue anymore. So this is, at the moment, I have more thoughts for future interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mizan, and thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to engage the audience now, if I might. Give me just 1 second to get the correct screen. Okay, hopefully you can all, if somebody could give me a visual, can you see the screen share again? So I'd like to invite the audience to go to a tool called Poll Everywhere. And you can do it one of two ways. Panelists, I've already captured your verbs, so you don't have to go. But the audience members, if you would, you can join one of two ways. You can go to the website pollev.com and just enter Cynthia Eisen H541 to answer this question: what verb best describes what needs to be done with our economy? So we've heard retool, we've heard a lot of different verbs. You can also join by text. So you would text Cynthia Eisen H541 to the number 37607. Once you do that, it will prompt you to respond to the question. So I'm going to give folks just a minute to do that. And I'm going to actually stop my share because I'm noticing that it is not updating in my PowerPoint. So I'm going to have to go to a different screen to show you the responses. Okay, and let me share this. Okay, so I was listening to all of our panelists and typing in the verbs that were used, and you can see this is updating live as our audience is also participating in this exercise. If you're not familiar with a word cloud, the way that it works is essentially the words that have the highest frequency counts are displayed in a larger font than the others. So you can see here we have revise, regulate, reimagine reimagine has just gained steam there. So you can see that there are a wide array of verbs that could be used here. Regulate is moving up, reimagine, revise, regulate, revisit. So a lot of different things that we could be doing. All right, thank you, everybody. Reimagine, regulate, revise. Retool is still there. I hate to shut this off because it's fun, but we'll move on now. Okay, so I want to ask folks in this next round to respond to a different question. Let me pull up the PowerPoint here. So in the second round, let's launch this.
Cindy, just to clarify, we have 3 or 5 minutes in this next round.
You have, let me just make sure I am not telling you. Oh, I've given what I've done in this next round. Oh, good question. There are 5. I'm sorry, I don't know why there are 3 there. I think I revised things and forgot to switch it. Sorry about that. So I'd like to ask everyone in this round, what are actors, and actors broadly conceived, right? Governments, individuals, public policy currently doing about the climate crisis that is not working? And conversely, are there spaces where you see progress, regardless of how you define progress? So in this round, I'm going to start with Mizan, who had to wait till the end the last time. So Mizan, go ahead and take the floor. What do you think that we're doing that is not working? And what do you think, where do you see potential progress on the horizon? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. In fact, in climate diplomacy, not many things are working. We have started with 24 gigatons back in 1992. Now we have close to 60 gigatons of greenhouse gases, more than 60% of which is carbon dioxide. So we are not doing well at all. Now, under the convention and the Paris Agreement, major industrial developed countries must take the lead. And now the major emitters also from the developing countries, China now is standing alone, contributing to over 30%. So this is kind of something that we need to take care. Now the catch is, for example, 2050 is the target, net zero emissions, and China and India are putting further 1960 and 1970. But these net zero emissions, if we are really sincere about, then why not we are having ambitious mitigation plans by 2025, by 2030? We don't see that kind of ambitious mitigation plans. So I'm not very sure about the sincerity of the net zero emissions by 2050. This is one thing. Another thing is, biologically, for example, we react to immediate events, immediate occurrences. This is the nature of biological species. Climate change is a decadal problem now. Weather is day to day. That is why people are more concerned with day-to-day climate events. There, what we need, which is not being done very well, that we need to invest more resources for making climate risks more visible, so that each and every citizen, each and every country in the world can be better sensitized. And now not only the LDC countries or the small island developing states are the first frontline victims. Industrial countries are also having these extreme events as the new normal, where even more than 200 people died in Germany, being a very developed, highly developed country historically. But in Bangladesh, we are doing it very well. For example, in terms of disaster management, Amphan happened about less than 2 years ago, and only we had 4 people, 4 deaths. The wind speed was 280 kilometers. But Bangladesh is still a low-income country. We are graduating soon from LDCs, but still a low-income country. And thanks to our social mobilization, that we could do this. And despite all this climate adversity, as well as development deficits, we are doing very good in terms of also adaptation. Now, the world looks at Bangladesh as a model of disaster management and model of adaptation. This depends not just on resources, not just on technology, but social capital, social mobilization, which in the developed world, where each and every individual is kind of an island. I spent long years of my life, I saw firsthand that each and every individual is an island in those societies. But in our societies, still we are not. But we are afraid that we may be moving towards that. This we need to arrest, this kind of erosion of social capital. This is another thing. So some countries, in terms of soft diplomacy, soft power, for example, globally, some countries, let me give the example of Sweden or Switzerland. Despite their smaller economy, population size economy, but their foreign policy based on empathy and sympathy, and their contributions of their GNI more than 0.7% is kind of a model that other countries should follow. So these are the few examples. And the NGOs, for example, are doing great works on the ground, because adaptation, particularly climate change, have impacts of landfalls in some specific places. So instead of giving focus on centralized management of adaptation initiatives, we need to promote now locally led adaptation, where resources should be devolved down to the local level. And here development partners have a great role to play, because they need to put pressure on the developing country centralized governments so that the real victims get better resources. Look at the success of Grameen Bank and BRAC, for example. The poor women, non-formally educated women, got little money in their hand, and they did make miracles. Where repayment rate is 97%, but globally billionaires don't pay back their loans. So this is the contradiction in the behavior between the poor people and the rich people across the world. So we need to refocus our energy and resources to those people who are real agents of change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mizan. Okay, we'll go next to Michael.
So what's not working? Well, I have written on this before, and I take a very critical view of the whole architecture constructed by the UN in relation to climate change. From my perspective, it's never worked. Why do I say that? Well, the main thing the architecture has done is to create a whole range of new economic instruments which governments game. I live in Southeast Asia. I've been there for many years, on and off, really since the 80s. I mean, I lived in Scotland as well, but I'm back here now. Malaysia calls monocultural palm oil estates, which are highly problematic in climate terms, forests. So then it claims that their carbon, it claims carbon credits on palm oil estates, which are actually extremely destructive of the ecosystem, sort of the capacity of Malaysia to respond in a resilient way to real changes in tropical climates. That's just one local example. There are dozens. I mean, Britain games the whole carbon. I mean, this is well known. It's been written about by people far more famous than me. The book Carbon Crunch, for example. But Britain games the carbon credit economics game by exporting all the heavy industry to other countries. So Turkey, for example, produces huge amounts of steel now, which is then imported into Europe, using vast amounts of coal, and then of course the European Union and Britain can claim they're shrinking their carbon footprint. They're still using steel, but they've simply exported the carbon emissions. The US has done exactly the same. Vast amounts of manufacturing moved to Mexico and China. There's some reshoring going on now. But this is my problem also with not only with the carbon credits, carbon emissions game, but also the zero growth argument, which, I mean, let's have a bit of argument here. I do believe that academics should argue with each other. And we've heard from at least one panelist that the answer is zero growth or degrowth. Well, I don't agree. I mean, the issue is not growth in general. As the previous speaker said, growth is still needed in developing countries. So people are not going to go hungry, if they're going to have potable water and drains and all the things that extended human life in countries like Britain and Europe after the disastrous effects initially on longevity and health of the Industrial Revolution. So clearly, many countries still need growth if they're to even start to catch up with the kinds of longevity and well-being that Western countries currently enjoy. Degrowth is a Western ideology. It's arguably also colonialist and will have extremely destructive effects on the developing world if the United Nations or the World Economic Forum or some other global agency finds a way to impose it on developing countries like Indonesia with 240 million people, most of whom live on probably less than $5 a day. So I don't support degrowth. I don't support the carbon credit, carbon emission scheme of the United Nations. For me, the most important word on the list that was composed in that nice democratic game that Cindy had us playing a few minutes ago was the word restore. Not reimagine, not retool, but restore. As I said in my first talk, and I admit I was perambulating and perhaps it was slightly distracting, but I'm now sitting down. As I said in my first brief talk, we need to restore the capacity of the Earth to respond to what is coming. I mean, even if we stopped all human carbon emissions, if they went just drop to zero, which of course is never going to happen, but even if we did, we're still going to have more, there's still more change coming in temperature terms. And as I said, I think some of it's geophysical and some of it's human. So the point is the Earth has responded in the past to much more dramatic climate changes than the ones that we are looking at in the present century. But it's done this by having vast numbers of creatures and extremely well-populated ecosystems, which are extremely effective in maintaining what James Lovelock in his Gaia theory calls the homeostasis of the planet, which is the capacity of the planet to keep the gases in the atmosphere at the right temperatures, and at the same time, the temperature of the Earth in a state habitable for life. So my view is that we need to focus on restoration. And unfortunately, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is so fetishized carbon emissions that essentially it completely ignores the deeper problem, which is that industrial civilization in general is wrecking ecosystems, and in so doing is preventing the Earth from responding in a more resilient way to climate change. Now, all the solar panels and the wind turbines in the world are not going to change this, are not going to address that problem, because the problem is not only carbon emissions. And I mean, I've been studying climate change for 20 years, and it's only really recently hit me, and it's very much a topic in my new book, that the real issue that we're ignoring is restoration. But this also connects to my background as a theologian. You know, I think that it's a mistake to imagine that human beings can save the Earth. No, we can only do it with the other beings, as I call them as a theologian, the other beings being the other creatures. We have to revive their capacities to resolve the problems we have created. And I would include in other beings non-industrialized people, particularly indigenous communities. I mean, I'm living on an island, Bali, at the moment. I have been for a couple of years, where we have an indigenous agricultural culture which is more than 1,000 years old, is extremely effective in sharing water across the watershed of Bali, and produces rice more effectively, more efficiently, and with less chemicals than any other rice grown system in the world. It's 1,000 years old. There was an attempt to impose an industrial green revolution system on Bali about 30 years ago, led by Swiss agricultural scientists, and it failed because they ignored the culture of Bali and they refused to accept that Bali could actually produce rice more efficiently than the scientists could. But in the end, the experiment failed because the island started to run out of water. They were overrun with pests because the common sharing of the watershed that was organized by the water temples failed when the scientists encouraged Balinese farmers to stop cooperating together and act in a more competitive fashion. So here in Bali, I see very much the importance of managing a system, an ecosystem in a way that acknowledges the importance of historic resilience in ecosystems. And this, I think, is what is lacking in the whole United Nations, and if I may say so, the economistic approach of degrowth. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, this round we'll go next to Paul, please.
All right, so again, I'll try to be a little provocative. The last two speakers pointed out that the current nation state cooperative approach doesn't seem to be working very well, both because of the incentives, and people have a lot of incentives to cheat. And so, and I think I agree with that. I think the incentives are all wrong for a global cooperative approach across nations. And so, although I do not like the idea of within state coercion, I'm not a fan of nation states coercing their citizens, I'm wondering if it may be the time for between state coercion. What I mean by that is that some successful efforts have been made to turn climate change into a national security issue, which does seem to mobilize people, politics, and resources, as we've seen over and over again. That certainly has its own risks and dangers, but that idea of securitizing climate change can mobilize resources that would lead to innovations, and also can lead to approaches that might allow for coalitions of the willing or individual states to take actions using coercive powers to move the behaviors of other nation states. Of course, my fear is that that will be used against low and middle income countries, something that Michael was pointing out often gets done. But you can go from low coercive end of just conditionality, withholding benefits, whether it be financial, diplomatic, technical, that go to another state and forcing it to adopt actions that work towards mitigating climate change, to something a little more coercive, carbon border tax adjustments that people are talking about and using. To the extreme would be military coercion. I would hate to see that. But again, just being provocative in the sense that, people talk about geoengineering. The benefits of that is that you don't need all the countries to agree. You just need a small coalition of the willing, in the extreme, just one nation state. I think that has much higher risks than the sort of coercive nation state approaches, like using conditionality or carbon border tax adjustments to push other states. But I do recognize that there's a big danger of that approach toward low and middle income countries. So moving to a low level, United States, since a lot of our audience is from the United States, we have 23 states that allow for referenda that it can include things like carbon taxes. They haven't been successful, but we haven't really tried to use them as much. And I think it's a missed opportunity for mobilizing politics. And one of the problems we have in the United States is we have a system that allows the majority who might be in favor of action on climate change to still lose at the polls, the ballot. And I think that if we try to push more on the referenda, we might have a better shot at getting at least a substantial proportion of the United States under some kind of pricing for emissions, which can have a substantial effect if people believe they're going to be permanent. I mean, the closest we came, I think, was Washington in 2016 with Initiative 732, which was a carbon tax modeled after British Columbia, and it was going to recycle the revenues to deal with the possible impacts on the poor, as well as to get conservatives on board who were worried about effects on industry. So it was going to lower other taxes. And unfortunately, a lot of environmental groups came out against it because they didn't like the way in which the revenues were used. I think that was a missed opportunity to make some political progress on retooling the economy and getting a persistent shift of resources away from emissions-oriented activities. And so with that, I'll just give back my time just so we can keep things on track. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. We're going to go next to Patricia. Patricia, thanks for your patience. I realized in looking at the schedule, you've had to wait a long time to speak. So please let us know what you have to say.
It's fair. It's a rotation, right? So my candidate for the what's not working is fossil fuel subsidies. The blind persistence of governments in subsidizing fossil fuel extraction, transport, refining, and use, I think, is the biggest example of refusal to recognize how some humans are endangering life on Earth. Fossil fuel subsidies are now about $5.9 trillion per year, or about $11 million a minute, roughly 6.8% of GDP, and this is increasing. I'll put in the chat an IMF report that talks about this. Big government subsidies for new and far-fetched carbon capture experiments are also grasping at straws to protect the corporate interests that depend on the fossil status quo, which is called carbon lock-in. And the latest is Elon Musk's foundation, private foundation, is also supporting carbon capture experiments last week there was an announcement of a Nova Scotia firm's subsidy of $1 million by the Elon Musk Foundation. Their plan is to treat and sprinkle alkaline mine tailings in the ocean to increase CO2 capture in the sea. So many of the governments that are doing this are democratically elected, and their failure to recognize the current crisis and lead the energy transition is symptomatic of the systematic dysfunction of capitalist political economies. Conversely, the fact that according to opinion polls, a strong majority of people in nearly all countries support strong action on climate change and environmental protection indicates that there is wide scope for climate action of many kinds. And this is pushing governments somewhat, to a small degree, unwillingly, towards a greener future. Unions and coalitions like Iron and Earth are building worker retraining programs so workers can make the switch from fossil fuel extraction to the many jobs in renewable power generation. Pension funds, individuals and universities are greening and defossilizing their investments. Homeowners are insulating their homes, adjusting thermostats, installing ground source heat pumps or solar hot water systems, and progressively reducing their energy use. Energy efficient appliances and lighting have become normalized, and technological change continues to reduce energy needs rapidly without sacrificing the quality and quantity of the services provided. People are opting for active transportation, local plant-based foods, reducing food waste, reusing and recycling materials. These are all climate actions with co-benefits for health, safety, and for communities and community interaction. These demand-side reductions in energy use and fossil fuels in particular have the potential to reduce carbon equivalent emissions by 40 to 70% within a few years, says the IPCC's most recent assessment report, which doesn't, the IPCC's reports are really not about governance so much as providing a summary of the vast amounts of scientific and peer-reviewed information so that governments can use it, but also making it available for people to understand what academic literature, what the synthesis of that literature is. Citizen activism by young people especially is building movements like Extraction Rebellion and Fridays for Future. These create political and social spaces in which people are building options and examples of how to opt out of capitalist growth imperatives and create alternative well-being structures. The recently released IPCC report also documents the synergies among equity-enhancing policies, social trust, and effective climate mitigation. Indigenous leadership and activist resistance to pipelines and other fossil fuel projects has produced a 12% reduction in CO2 emissions in the US and Canada over the past 10 years. It's the single largest reduction in carbon emissions in North America. Nearly 1 billion tons of CO2 per year, directly related to Indigenous activism. This is according to a report by the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International. I'll put that link in the chat as well. Artists are leading the cultural change that raises up sufficiency, human environment interrelationships, and mutual assistance in times of risk and crisis. Everywhere you look, there are grassroots movements for green energy, community resilience, progressive urban planning and transportation, and shared strategies to address climate risks at the local level. Renewable energy is produced everywhere the sun shines and the wind blows. Renewable energy systems build local autonomy. Huge energy grids are symptomatic of the extractive nature of fossil and nuclear energy systems. They are mechanisms for siphoning off energy revenues to central corporations and authorities. In the post-fossil future, those kinds of big grids are needed only as an emergency backup. Local energy systems are socially, ecologically, and weather appropriate. They are not cookie cutter replicas of those in places everywhere. So I'll stop there, but there are certainly things that are not working, and there are other things that are working, in my view. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay, and the last word in this round goes to Jason. Jason, please.
Oh, thank you. Just a second here. I've been listening with interest to my colleagues, and I do have a few things I'd like to respond to. First, to a few things that Paul and Michael have said, if it's all right. And I want to begin with the claim they've made that degrowth is against the interests of poor countries. This claim is actually astonishingly incorrect. Degrowth is explicitly about high-income nations, where productive capacity and energy use is well in excess of what is necessary to meet human needs even at a high standard, empirically, right? This is literally the first thing you will notice from even a cursory reading of literature in ecological economics. And so it's very clear to me that you have not read about this literature, and I think it's irresponsible to have made these statements, which are so egregiously incorrect. In climate economy models, it's clear that we need a reduction in global energy use. This was published even in the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. But this reduction should be sustained in the rich nations, right? Not imposed on poor countries, which need to increase, in fact, their energy use in order to meet human needs at a high standard. So I think it's incumbent on us to inform ourselves and correct these statements on the record, if possible. We're scientists and we have to behave that way. Again,
I do feel, since you're addressing me directly, that my comments were not a result of misinformation. In Scotland and some other parts of the world, the US included, degrowth is already having perverse effects, which I would argue are entirely analogous to colonization on the poor households. In Scotland, people are already having to make choices between.
Sorry, if I may just continue here. Sorry.
Yeah, Michael, let's please let Jason continue, since it is his 5 minutes, and we can come back to you in the next round, please. Thank you. Jason, go ahead. Just
to clarify, there has been no degrowth in Scotland or the USA or any rich country. It has literally never been done, right? What you're talking about is a recession, and degrowth is distinguished from recessions very clearly in the literature. Again, this would be evidence from any reading of these texts. And again, this is clear. All of this is clear, by the way, in the IPCC reports themselves, which discuss degrowth, also in the IPBES. It's not arcane literature. My second point is this. Paul says that we need to rapidly scale renewable energy. Yes, I agree 100%. My point is simply that in order to do this, if we do this while pursuing growth at the same time, we know, again, from the climate economy models, it makes our task more difficult. It means we have to produce more renewable energy than would otherwise be the case, right? So it's like trying to run down an up escalator. Why would you make our lives more difficult? So yes, we need as much renewable energy as possible, but in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, high-income nations also at the same time need to reduce aggregate energy use so that we can accomplish this more quickly, no? So this is crucial. My third point is this. Paul says that capitalism is necessary to rapidly scale renewable energy. Actually, in fact, and this is demonstrated by a recent empirical paper, capital prefers fossil fuel investments because they deliver bigger profits than renewables do, right? And this is precisely why renewables are not being scaled fast enough. It's a market failure. So if we want to do this project, it's going to require state-directed investment strategies and state-backed innovation, which has always been the case with major social projects, everything from roads to wars to the internet. It's actually very well established in the literature now that state intervention is going to be important for this, right? I mean, listening to you, honestly, it sounds like 10 years ago. Number 4, Paul says that absolute decoupling of GDP from emissions is possible. Yes, it is possible. Of course it is. It's called renewable energy. And it's been happening in high-income nations for more than a decade. The problem, again, is one of speed, right? So even the highest performing countries, including Sweden, are not even close to being on track to cutting emissions fast enough for the Paris Agreement targets. To do that, again, they need to reduce energy demand. And to do that, they need to scale down socially less necessary forms of production. And it's not clear to me why you would be so against this, right? If we're talking about slowing down production of SUVs and industrial beef and fast fashion, why would you be against this? First, I think it's incumbent on you to defend why we would want to devote energy to these practices, these forms of production that have nothing to do with human well-being in the middle of a climate and ecological emergency. The onus, I think, is on your position. Number 5, Paul says that doesn't growth lead to improvements in social indicators? Yes, there's clearly a correlation, but it's logarithmic. And this has been pointed out for the past several decades. After a certain level of GDP per capita, which high-income nations have long surpassed, there are drastically diminishing returns, right? So it's not aggregate commodity production that matters. Even Preston himself in 1975 was clear about this. What matters is what we are producing, okay? Whether people have access to the things they actually need, okay? Which is, by the way, not the case in the USA, despite being extremely rich, and how income is distributed. And this is why dozens of nations outperform the USA on social indicators, such as life expectancy, infant mortality, et cetera, with much less GDP per capita, right? Spain outperforms the USA, 55% less GDP per capita. Portugal, 65% less GDP per capita. Costa Rica, 80% less GDP per capita. What is the defense in the USA for additional growth? By the way, if you care about infant mortality, you might note that Cuba outperforms the USA with a fraction of the GDP per capita. So it's not clear to me what additional growth in the USA will deliver you. Number 6, Paul says that capitalism is responsible for improving human welfare. This view is not supported by historical evidence. Reading Simon Schreiter, for example, a Cambridge historian, is very clear on this. The historical record is clear that for the first 400 years of capitalist history, from the 1500s to the 1800s, integration into the capitalist world system, including Europe, but also especially the colonized world, was associated with a dramatic deterioration in social indicators in all regions, including a decline in real wages of workers, reduced nutrition, and increased mortality. Improvements only begin in Western Europe in the late 19th century, right? With the rise of labor movements and the democracy movements, which succeeded in winning things like workers' rights, decent wages, public services, sanitation facilities, and so on, which delivered extraordinary improvements in human welfare. But these gains were won against the interests of the capitalist class. So my point here is that progress is not handed down by capital automatically from on high. It is won by progressive social movements that change the objectives of production, okay, and redistribute resources. And this is exactly what we're going to have to rely on in the face of the present crisis as well, okay? Finally, my last remark is Paul's point about not wanting authoritarian interventions. If I understand him correctly, I agree. Authoritarianism, I'm very against. We want democracy, and degrowth is very clear about the need for economic democracy. We know empirically, and this is evident in the literature, that first, in polls, including in the USA, large majorities of people support the idea that governments should focus on human well-being and ecological stability rather than on growth and capital accumulation, right? There's a strong democratic consensus about this. We also know that under democratic conditions, people make decisions in favor of ecology and in favor of fair distribution, okay? So we must ask ourselves, why is this not happening? And the answer is that we do not live in a democracy, right? This is obvious when it comes to campaign finance, et cetera, et cetera. The interests of elites are prioritized in policymaking, but furthermore, because capitalism itself is not democratic. It is a system of production where decisions about what to produce and how to allocate resources are made by a small faction of the population, namely those who own capital, and the majority of people have no say in this, right? So yes, we want democracy. That's going to require a shift to a post-capitalist economy. We should have the freedom to imagine this, right? So shutting this down, I don't see making a lot of sense. And I'll leave my comments.
Jason, thank you. Yeah, thank you. In the interest of time, we'll have to move on. What I'd like to propose is we take a minute. I want to engage the audience briefly here, and then I'd like to give Paul and Michael, if you can, a minute to respond to Jason, if you'd like. If not, that's fine as well. But I'd like to invite the audience. So we're going to be starting to shift toward this question. The second part of this question is, where do you see progress happening? So of course, Patricia has put a few links in the chat. I'd like to invite our audience to also put links in the chat, examples of places where you see positive progress regardless of the scale. And I will compile those after the event and share those with the attendee list. So folks, feel free to just explode the chat there. Okay, Michael, would you like to take a minute to respond to Jason?
Yeah, sure. I said already that my sense is that climate change, taxes, regulations, and the related quest for lower economic growth by the West is already impacting on poor people in the West. and particularly in the US, where the state provides so little in terms of the essentials of life. But even in Scotland, where the majority of people work for the state, and it's almost a socialist republic, these regulations, climate regulations in general, and the quest for lower growth are having really deleterious impacts on human well-being. I've spoken about this in conferences in Scotland. I've published briefly on it. But you speak of degrowth as a sort of clearly marked out scientific theory. I'm talking about the impacts of attempts to restrain the traditional economy on working class families. And this is one of the main sources, actually, of democratic resistance to climate science, because so many working class families have lost their reliable unionized jobs because they've been outsourced to other countries, so that the countries where they used to work, who used to have these jobs, can claim they're now lower carbon, as I mentioned at the beginning. So we just have to look very carefully. The idea that one can decouple degrowth in North America from degrowth in Asia, and again, Paul makes the same point, but I think that's the real issue. I think it's a very dangerous ideology. Unless we move away from industrial civilization and its practices, particularly of monoculture and of toxic manufacturing and consumerism, unless we move away from those and reform those, degrowth doesn't necessarily resolve the issues that I think are really central to the capacity of the planet to respond in a resilient way.
Thank you, Michael.
To climate change.
Thank you, Michael. Paul, 1 minute.
That's okay. I don't need it. I responded in the chat box, and I think it's good to have disagreements. I think it's more interesting for the audience.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so again, I invite the audience to include in the chat any examples of places where you see positive transitions happening at any scale. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the final question for our panelists. And as you all may realize, we're a little behind our schedule at the moment. So I'd like to, if at all possible, ask you to make your comments in 3 minutes or so that we can leave some time. We do have some great questions from the audience in the chat. So the question is, moving forward, what policies and/or programs do you think hold the most promise for transitioning to a climate viable and just economic forms? So we've already heard some mentioned from Michael and Patricia and others, but I'll invite you to make your kind of final case for what types of policies and programs or social movements you think have the most promise to move us to something that is sustainable in this moment of climate crisis. Okay, and this time I have Patricia leading off. Thank you, Patricia.
Thanks, Cindy. I just have a few comments, and maybe we'll get back on schedule. I don't know. I think that one really promising thing is that equity enhancing public policies go hand in hand with risk resilience, social protections, trust in collective governance, and society's ability to face the climate crisis. This is a justice-oriented energy transition. This means that a justice-oriented energy transition is or can be a rapid energy transition. These things are all, interlinked. If governments are captured by corporate interests, which I think they are, and therefore not able to see and act on this understanding, the understanding about the connections between social equity and rapid energy transition, then what happens is that people are creating shared risk reduction strategies outside of government policies and programs. They already are doing this in wildfires, droughts, ice storms, and heat domes. People do their best to help each other, especially in small communities. This empathy is built on interrelationships of social connection, not market interactions. And I think of the photos that we see in all crises of people helping each other. I remember a photo of the heat dome in British Columbia last year, where community in church basements and out in parking lots, people were sharing, were bringing sandwiches and food from home and welcoming people who were out of their homes. And people do step up and respond in times of crisis. So in the face of government failures to lead, local leaders step up, and Indigenous leaders who have ontological strength and credibility underlining their actions as well. This kind of leadership is unparalleled. My current main concern centers around the vast disparities across countries, the global disparities, and access to the low emission technologies that are central to providing services for well-being and reducing drudgery and opening opportunities for people, especially women, all over the world. This includes low emissions cook stoves, lighting, refrigeration, water pumps, sanitation equipment, and other basic technologies. We don't hear much about how intellectual property rules and global trade agreements impede the free flow of green tech for the energy transition. But activists in the global South agree that this is a serious and growing problem. So pushing for open access and open source dissemination of the technological breakthroughs that are reducing energy needs to provide these basic services, that's vitally important, I think. We've seen with COVID vaccines that global mechanisms for the distribution of vital information and supplies are pitifully inequitable. So it's the global climate justice challenge that is the most pressing need, in my view. And this requires global solidarity, movements, and action at scale. And it's entirely possible with communications technologies that are now available, and with the migration that's happening, more and more people have these connections across the globe that facilitate this kind of solidarity. So I'm not without hope, but I think that this is the main challenge now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Patricia. Jason, what policies, programs, social movements do you think hold the most promise for transitioning toward climate viable and just economic forms? Thank you.
Right, just a second here. Okay, so I guess the first thing I would say is, look, I think we have a lot to owe groups like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future and so on, which have clearly brought the urgency of climate policy to the fore of our political discussion. I think that's very important. On the other hand, I think that these movements are probably not strong enough to pull off the kind of rapid transition that we need. Largely because they don't have the political power, right? But what groups do have the political power? And I think that the answer to that is probably something closer to working class political formations. And this is going to require a significant shift, in existing environmentalist discourse. Existing environmentalist discourse tends to focus on consumption as a major problem. And there's no way that working class communities can get on board with this, because in most cases they actually feel a significant deficit. They're trying to meet their basic needs and they cannot, right? They live in poverty in many cases, in the USA, for example, in the UK. So in order to build these alliances between the environmentalist movement and working class political movements, I think there needs to be a focus on precisely the social policies that I mentioned, which I think Michael has unfortunately left out of the picture of our discussion about degrowth. Degrowth is explicit about calling for a shorter working week and a climate job guarantee to prevent any unemployment, a radical redistribution of income, and universal basic services to ensure that everybody has access to the resources they need to live good, dignified lives with living wages, right? Therefore, taking the question of livelihoods off the table permanently. If we can organize around these objectives, then we can bring a broad alliance forward that has the political power to unseat incumbents or otherwise force them to change course, okay? Because it's clear that our existing elites are not acting fast enough. And I think we can all agree on that fact. This is abundantly clear. And this is important, I think, because it would help liberate us from the existing political logjam. Right now, we can't even talk about even modest climate action because there's a fear that the impacts might be harmful for employment, right? So we can deal with this problem directly with the measures that I propose, and which again are central to ecological economics, which would allow us the political freedom to take climate action without anyone worrying about anyone getting hurt, right? This is what a just transition looks like: a social guarantee, a decommodification of the core social sector, to ensure that there's no deficit of access to key services and resources. So to me, this is important, and I see it really sadly lacking in much existing environmentalist discourse, and perhaps people like Michael and Paul would be more favorable to our ideas if they appreciated that this was actually at the core of it, right? And so this notion that climate action is harming working communities in Scotland, yes, of course it is, because we live in a capitalist system that doesn't care about working class communities, right? What we're calling for is a transition to a different kind of economy that prioritizes working class communities and vulnerable people, and ensures that nobody is in a position of harm during the transition. I think that's essential to successful climate politics.
Thank you, Jason. We turn now to Mizan.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, some of the solutions already have been discussed. Just I will be brief in just bullet forms. First, in order to put the economy back on climate viable track, I think we can have some tools to introduce, which have been discussed for quite some time. First, about generation, some auto-generation mechanisms to raise revenues for provision of global public goods. Like, for example, polluter pays principle is the most fundamental of solutions in the form of carbon tax, carbon price, or emissions trading, as you know. And then in Europe, for example, there are in a smaller scale financial transaction tax. 11, 12 EU countries are covered, but this can be extended globally. Then there can be little tax on arms trade, global arms trade. It's a global public bad. So we need to finance through taxing global public bads and answer. More than $2 trillion are invested in military expenditure for addressing perceived threats. But climate change is a real threat, but a few $1 billion are not available. So this is what is wrong with our behavior pattern. So, and then more investment in social science research, because climate change, science is reaching its highest level of development, with more and more conferences coming up with their findings and kind of suggestions. But social science is not progressing at all. Social science research, why citizens and governments are not moving ahead. So we need to invest more money, more energy for doing, dissecting the human behavioral pattern. What keeps us standing back. This is another kind of my suggestion. And then our next suggestion is, for example, private sector is the engine of growth, but they are the savior too, and they are the biggest polluter. So here is an introduction of carrots and the stick policy to motivate the private sector through their corporate social responsibility. Though there is quite a lot of greenwashing, but we need to turn this greenwashing into real whitewashing in the positive sense of the term. And then the fossil fuels, elimination of the fossil fuel subsidy. At COP26, there was big drama, particularly led by India, you know, because India is in the most difficult position in climate diplomacy, where they have insisted for fossil fuel phase down, not phase out. Because in India, more than 250 million poor people don't have access to electricity. So they have the compulsion for using fossil fuel. Finally, in terms of degrowth, you know, we need to differentiate between growth and development. Growth is physical expansion of a system, which may lead to development or may not lead. But development is improvement in the quality of a system. For example, in America, we have more than 200 types of soft drinks. Most of them are junk productions. They don't add to better quality of life. So we need to focus more on development, where degrowth can be applied first in the major industrial countries and then to other high-income developing countries. So these are some of my suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mizan. Michael.
Yeah, just to comment on some of the points made earlier, I think that where climate policy is most successful is where it combines social equity and ecological care.
Yes.
Repeat that. Where climate policy is most successful is where it combines a concern with social equity and ecological care. It's not purely about technical fixes or economic fixes or ideological fixes. And my concern about degrowth is it's yet another Western ideology, which I still remain concerned about. I fully take Jason's points about the fact that we're living in a post-colonial era, which is effectively still a colonial era. I mean, I don't disagree with that in the least. I've been living in the developing world for much of my life, and I see it all the time. There's no question that degrowth, if properly managed, so that people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates got poorer, and working people had enough to eat and decent healthcare in the United States, could help to reduce resource extraction in the developing world. Unfortunately, the dominance of the economic profession in DC and the City of London and so on means that economic ideologies are not addressing social equity. And the issue of ecological restoration isn't being restored either, because the focus is always on numbers. And as I said, the numbers games are the carbon game is played. So what is successful on the ground then are schemes where social equity and ecological care are brought together. I mean, in Indonesia, this would be, and in Malaysia, this would be, for example, places where indigenous people have been given a role in protecting old growth forests. For example, there's a peace park in Sarawak, which was established by the Penang in an attempt to prevent palm oil and related logging of the highlands, a very rare and precious tropical rainforest of Borneo, from being destroyed. They set up a peace park, which is now co-managed by indigenous people and the state government. And that has secured social equity for the Penang. It has secured that very important region in terms of biodiversity and as a climate sink. At the same time, it prevents government corruption, which unfortunately can even infect conservation science from destroying yet more of the forest. There are many other examples around the world that one could equally use. From the UK, I would note that over a third of people now claim to be involved in food growing. That's very good for the climate, and it's very good for social equity. So there are solutions already all over the world which link social equity and ecological care. And that to me is the future, really. It needs to be the future. But I don't think it fits neatly into an economic model. It's more complex. It's both human, it's about care of people and planet. So that the programs and policies are directed both towards the planet and people at the same time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Last but not least, Paul.
All right, so the question is, what policies or program do you think hold most promise for transition and climate viable economic forms? I would love it if some of these ideas of changing the entire structure of how economic activity takes place, or our ideologies or norms could be done, but I don't see how that could be done. I don't want to abandon this idea of having more equitable, ecological focused growth. But when I think about success stories that are large scale, they often don't seem to be based on that. They based on what people just said, I don't want to keep doing that activity. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the classic one is whale populations, right? Whale populations, for all the whales that we have good data for, nearly all of them are going up, right? And it wasn't because people suddenly became like, oh, whales are important, we can't let this gorgeous species go to extinction, it's a keystone species in the oceans. It was because that we mainly hunted whale for oil, and then it became economically irrelevant. Why would you bother hunting whales anymore? I mean, meat production was a tiny fraction of it. So it became very costless to get a global agreement on stopping this destruction of the whale populations and letting them recover. Now, we were lucky that a lot of the whales had not been driven to a point where they could not recover. But the same thing is what I see is that if we invest more in research and development. We do not need global agreements. We don't need decoupling of high income nations from low and middle income nations. We don't need to change people's aspirations and get my academic colleagues and my conservation colleagues to stop flying everywhere across the world for all these conferences that they're going to, right? That these are not commodity-based aspirations, but they are huge carbon footprint. We just find ways that people say, well, that'd be silly. Why would I burn more coal? Why would I burn oil? Why would I emit greenhouse gas emissions? That costs more. Like the same conversations we have with people who say, I put solar panels on my house. I'm not an environmentalist. It just made sense. Right? Why would I do otherwise? It would have been silly to do. This is a huge gamble. I think everything we're talking about is a huge gamble, right? That we're putting our hopes in these sorts of approaches. But I have seen humans do incredible things when there are resources. So I totally agree with Jason about state-directed interventions, but just relying only on state-directed interventions to achieve this, I think would be a mistake. Both because states tend to be corrupted with all that resources and all that power. And I also think they're not as efficient in coming up with ideas and spreading those ideas. So there needs to be state, private partnerships to innovate in ways that will allow us to, I agree. So yeah, state carbon prices, state intervention, totally agree. So it's a regulated market-based approach. But we need the innovation so that we do not have to try to steer this entire trajectory over the last 100 years in a completely different direction, where people just say, why would I do anything else other than have a clean energy future? So that's what I think. Thanks for your time. It's a great panel.
Thank you so much, Paul and Patricia and Jason and Michael and Mizan. What a great discussion. I appreciated the friendly debate and your wonderful ideas. So we have a few questions in the chat that I'd like to pose to everyone. Let's see if, Arana, would you like to unmute and ask your question about the role of powerful corporate interests in decision-making?
Yeah, hi, I'm just curious about the panelist perspective on the potential magnitude of the impact by shareholder activism in financial markets to drive both the producers of fossil fuel based energy out of to drive the producers of fossil fuel based energy out of business, and also, I guess, on the way to that, to put pressure on people who use energy to stop getting supplied by fossil fuels. Is that a significant activity, or is it marginal in your estimation?
Thank you, Maria. Anybody want to start off with that one? Shareholder activism potential?
I could
go for it, Paul. Yeah.
In my personal opinion, I don't want to say marginal. I just want to say we all have to do what we can do. I can't develop new clean energy technology, so I'm going to do something instead. So I appreciate Mizan saying we should have more money for social and behavioral scientists. I'm not sure I agree, but for the stakeholder activism, shareholder activism, I see that, not being going to be dramatic. Certainly for some large supply chain oriented corporations, it can have an impact, and we shouldn't neglect it. But when you look at what happens when fuel prices or energy prices go up throughout the world, low, middle income, high income nations, people freak out, politicians freak out. I totally agree that private sector capitalist interests corrupt the political system, but I don't think that that's like the binding constraint. I think all the people who are consumers are driving a lot of what we're seeing.
I can say that, for ending apartheid in South Africa, the global movement around divestment was an important, maybe not equally important, equally to the impact on South Africa was the fact that it signified a cultural change, a change in world opinion and in people's volition about what should happen. So a lot of the ideas that I sort of rattled off there are all parts, aspects of this cultural change that I believe is underway. And so it's symbolically important as well as having some financial impact, I think. And I'm not an expert on the empirical analysis of how important that is, but the fact that Mark Carney is now, the UN climate change finance guy. I mean, the financial markets are aware of the increasing risks that inhere in making fossil infrastructure into stranded assets. And so the finance pieces are part of this picture if you look at it from a business side, which, as I say, is not the only way to look at it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the question, Maria. Does anybody else want to address it? Impact investing? Jason?
I'll just very briefly say that I think that the divestment movement is one of the most successful arms of the broader climate struggle. And I think that specifically their shift recently to target the investment arms of large banks is very powerful, actually, right? So to the extent that we can get banks to stop financing new fossil fuel projects, which, by the way, is consistent with IPCC reports that indicate that we cannot be financing any new fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So I think the movement to target that is very powerful, actually, and we should double down on that. And I hope my colleagues will agree.
Thank you, Jason. So we have two additional questions in the chat, one from Arana Taylor and one from Bruna Demarius. Sorry for my probably horrible pronunciation there. It's been a long time since I've had French. Would either one of you like to unmute and ask your question?
Well, yeah, sure. First, thank you for this fascinating conference. Well, for me, climate change is deeply linked to educational issues. And I think we need to put this issue at the center of, we need to make a thorough rethinking of education, because basically as when I TA or when I come at Hopkins, I am super surprised by how little students seem to be concerned about climate change problems, and how little this basic culture of climate problems how little this culture is among students. So I would like to know, for instance, what we can imagine for broadening this climate education. For instance, I could see that at Hopkins, there is only one master's degree in environmental science. This master's degree is probably very expensive, not very accessible. So what can we do to just expand this basic knowledge about climate problems? That's a question. Also because I'm a dual citizen, so US academia is important to me, for sure.
Thank you so much. Mizan, Patricia, maybe you'd like to take this one? Mizan, let me see if you can unmute.
Yes, this is close to my heart. We have written a book on Paris Agreement Article 11 on capacity building, published by Routledge from London. Yes, very valid question. This is one of the basic solutions. As I have emphasized in my interventions, that behavioral change is one of the most cardinal solutions, though it will take a little longer time, but most sustainable solution. We need to invest more money starting from the school, for the school children up the university level, for introducing climate education. And climate education models can be both as a standalone program at the university level, or can be mainstreamed, particularly with the business schools and business syllabus, because business students learn how to make money. But environmental students, for example, we teach environmental students of how to enjoy life with less money. This is the basic difference between so-called modern business education, who always move with the calculator and calculating the internal rate of returns always. So there, this lady, Brune, raised the valid question. That is where we need to do more social science research and investment in social science. Okay, I hope UNFCCC parties, we will be attending at SB, and I also coordinate the Action for Climate Empowerment, which is the Doha education program, 10-year now, the Glasgow 10-year program. So you'll highlight these issues that raised here in terms of education and capacity building at the SB session just coming up in early June in Bonn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mizan. Patricia, do you want to hit this question before we depart?
Yes, can I say something just very briefly? I think that related to education is the idea of general awareness and understanding about what's happening with global climate change. And there is massive obfuscation going on by governments and also by the private sector to, for example, you know, on all levels around fossil fuel production and saying that, oh, it is possible to have low carbon natural gas productions, say offshore in offshore of Newfoundland. But when it's exported, of course, it's the emissions count for somebody else. And there are so many levels at which the governments and business sector is actively trying to confuse people and demoralize, you know, sap the hope that climate change can be effectively addressed. So this is related to the education question. People need the education in order to separate out the fake news. Thanks.
Well, everyone, I want to invite you all to help me thank the panel for a really wonderful discussion today and for your time. I appreciate it very much. I'd also like to extend sincere gratitude to Navita Khan and her colleagues at Johns Hopkins, the Sawyer Seminar, and to the Mellon Foundation for making this possible. We will follow up with recordings of today's workshop as well as some resources from the chat. So thank you once again to everyone, and we will end promptly knowing that many of you probably have 11 o'clock meetings and it's very late where Mizan and Michael are. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day, wonderful weekend, and goodbye.